On the southern outskirts of Miami, in the dusty subdivision of Richmond, lay an abandoned naval airbase. The abandoned airbase had been leased by the Navy to the University of Miami for research purposes, following its disuse after World War II. In early 1962, the University of Miami welcomed new tenants to their vacant facilities, a nondescript firm that went by the name of Zenith Technical Enterprises, Inc. In reality, this company was a cutout for the CIA, who were in the process of moving their Miami JMWAVE station from a block of houses in the Coral Gable neighborhood of Miami to the expansive complex in Richmond. This move signaled the massive increase in agency covert activity on the Florida coast that was coming in 1962. Specifically, February of that year marked two key events that would launch this explosion of schemes in South Florida. Firstly, as I previously covered before, in February of 1962, President Kennedy launched the White House-directed anti-Castro program under Operation Mongoose, headed jointly by his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, and former CIA counterinsurgency expert, General Edward Lansdale. The sanctioning of Mongoose and the inclusion of the CIA in its rollout would directly contribute to the massive expansion of JMWAVE personnel and activities throughout the next 2 years. But also in February 1962, CIA Deputy Director of Plans Richard Helms ordered a new covert operations chief to Miami to coordinate activities from the Zenith Technical Enterprises site in Richmond, Florida. That covert ops chief, who would quickly assume the role of full station chief, was none other than Ted Shackley, the man I covered extensively in the previous video. Shackley's arrival in his native Florida coincided with a dramatic multiplication of White House-sanctioned and otherwise unsanctioned operations in the surrounding area, especially as the growing Cuban exile community in Miami's Little Havana became increasingly militant and impatient. The new JMWAVE station emerged as the center of a swirling nexus of CIA agents, Cuban exiles, military intelligence officers, organized crime figures, and soldiers of fortune, all working in their own way towards Castro's downfall. The Miami area was soon teeming with spooks of all sorts. As Hinkle and Turner note in their book titled The Fish is Red, quote, Eastern Airlines' midday Electra flight from Washington to Miami became known inside the CIA as the Miami Milk Run, because as many as half of the passengers might be on agency payroll, end quote. South Florida was quickly flooded with spooks and rogues of all sorts, training and planning to defeat the bearded leader of Cuba. And at the center of the sprawling octopus was the CIA, the main benefactor of the countless organizations and movements that spawned seemingly out of nowhere in the Sunshine State. For the first months of Operation Mongoose, the CIA White House gravy train was in full swing, and covert funds were flowing to seemingly any and all Cuban exiles, soldiers of fortune, or adventurers that were set against Castro's Cuba. But in empowering such militant and uncontrollable forces, the CIA and, for a time, the White House were arming the very forces that have been speculated of taking down the president himself. As we will see, on the Gulf Coast in 62 and 63, nothing was as it seemed. And with that in mind, let's dive into the story of the Miami CIA station, codenamed JMWAVE.
I will do my level best to stand up for freedom and democracy around the world by keeping the United States of America strong and by keeping our eyes wide open as we welcome change in the world, but keeping our eyes wide open.
I want to start today with a bit of context surrounding the Cuban exile community in Miami. Since Castro took power in 1959, according to Hinkle and Turner, on average 1,000 new Cuban exiles entered Miami every month. This constant stream of disaffected anti-Castro migrants presented the JMWAVE station with a continuous retinue of fresh recruits to pull from. From day one of the CIA Cuba show, the Miami Cubans came to represent the vast majority of the foot soldiers employed in the secret war. In effect, the agency's anti-Castro operations lived and died with the Cuban exiles. To the Cubans in Miami's Little Havana neighborhood, the expansion in CIA activities related to Operation Mongoose in early 1962 exemplified the Kennedy brothers' recommitment to deposing Castro, a commitment that John Kennedy had first made all the way back on the campaign trail in 1960. The failure at the Bay of Pigs in 1961, the year earlier, had discouraged these same exiles, seeing over 1,000 of their most ardent members taken prisoner in Cuba following the ill-advised, doomed-to-fail CIA-organized invasion. Yet the bolstering of anti-Castro operations throughout 1962 brought new hope, but also a certain weariness. Understand, these exiles had already been told several times that they were being supported implicitly by both Democrats and Republicans. They had seen their countrymen leave to train at facilities in Guatemala and Nicaragua, and had been let down by the failure at the Bay of Pigs. Although it was the CIA that used them as pawns, the Kennedys were the ones to take the blame. Mongoose represented new hope. Hope that would be short-lived, though. As in October of '62, only a little over 8 months after the Lansdale Kennedy regime change operation was kicked off, the nation and the young president would be faced with the most significant flashpoint of his short presidency, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Facing the existential threat of nuclear Armageddon, JFK once again, understandably given the stakes, sidelined the exiles and began the process of closing the Pandora's box that he had opened earlier that year. A box that his administration would be unable to contain. Interestingly, according to Edward Lansdale's blissfully optimistic Operation Mongoose timetable, October 1962 was also slated to be the climactic moment where the Cuban people would rise up in open revolt and overthrow Castro. Lansdale's plan remained a pipe dream, even without the missile crisis. But for those 8 months, where Mongoose was in full swing, from February to October, money and guns were flowing in the streets of Little Havana. This was just as the blonde ghost himself, Ted Shackley, the new station chief at JMWAVE, was entering the Zenith Technical Enterprises lot for the first time in the very same February of '62. By this point, JMWAVE station had become a small spy city of its own, teeming with not only CIA officers, who did make up the majority of its staff, but also a significant retinue of paramilitary experts, usually on loan from the Army or the Marine Corps. You have to remember, in the early 60s, the CIA itself had little experience in paramilitary operations. These functions were fairly new for the agency, who at the exact same time that JMWAVE was working with Cuban rebel groups, was also bolstering its guerrilla warfare capabilities in Laos and Thailand, using again Army and Marine staff on loan as the primary instructors. To the military staff at the JMWAVE base, the chaos and seeming disorganization of the whole affair stood out comparatively to the regimented discipline expected on US military bases. Bradley Ayers, an Army paratrooper working at JMWAVE, training Cuban exiles, shared his initial reactions at seeing the spy base to authors Warren Hinkle and William Turner. Quote, "I had envisioned it as a highly responsive, uncluttered organization, but it now appeared to be a sprawling, bureaucratic monster." End quote. The base was home to some 400 to 600 CIA case officers at any time, managing an estimated 3,000 or so Cuban exile assets, according to Douglas Valentine and Hinkle and Turner. This presented new station chief Shackley with an unprecedented operational scope, with some 3,000 assets under his purview, for one of the first times the CIA was overseeing a veritable secret army. As the official story goes, as relayed in his official memoir titled Spy Master, Shackley was actually not brought into Miami with the original intention of serving as station chief. CIA Cuba czar Bill Harvey had wanted the blonde ghost to serve as the chief of operations at the base, one rung below the acting station chief, one Al Cox. As Shackley describes it, only a little over a week after taking over his new role in Miami in February of '62, Harvey visited from CIA HQ in DC to come check in on the base and to see how Shackley was settling in. As it would have it, Ted picked Harvey up at the airport, as Al Cox, the station chief I'll remind you, was out sick that day. The hot-headed Bill Harvey reportedly then had Shackley drive him directly to Cox's house to sort this out. The always cool Ted said that it wasn't appropriate. Harvey agreed, and instead, he fired Al Cox and promoted Shackley the next day. That's the sanitized story as Shackley describes it anyways. Now, when I first read the story, I mostly glossed over the name Al Cox, but for some reason it stuck in my head. It seemed familiar, like I had heard the name before. And to the most diligent of Eyes Wide Open viewers, this name might sound familiar as well. And that's because I mentioned Alfred Cox a long time ago, all the way back in my History of the CIA video about the Golden Triangle. Once I went back and looked into his story, It became clear that Shackley's small mention of him in his memoir, as the JMWAVE station chief before him, was only telling a very small slice of the Al Cox story, glossing over what I find to be very relevant agency work beforehand in the Far East. According to Alfred Cox's 1973 New York Times obituary, he had started his career as an OSS officer during World War II, where he was engaged in commando activities behind enemy lines in North Africa, Italy, and France, as a part of the now famous Jedburgh teams, the precursors to the US Army Special Forces, led by OSS Colonel Aaron Bank, himself the future first commander of the Green Berets, later in the early 50s. Alongside Cox in these early US Special Forces units at the OSS were such future counterinsurgency experts as Lucien Canet, a man who, as we saw in the last episode, worked closely with Shackley at the Nuremberg base early in the Blonde Ghost's CIA career, and future General John Singlob, the future MACV-SOG commander in Laos and Vietnam. Again, a man who would work closely with Shackley later down the line. But maybe most interestingly, Al Cox ended his OSS service in China at the end of World War II, this time training nationalist Chinese commandos in paramilitary work. Now, to anyone who's watched my videos, OSS work in China at the end of World War II should immediately raise some flags. We can conceivably assume that he was likely in contact and maybe even served under the chief of OSS secret intelligence in China at the time, none other than Paul Helliwell, a man that I have discussed at length on this channel, as the originator of the CIA narco complex, and a man who will come up again later in this episode. The New York Times obituary about Cox continues by stating that he met Claire Chennault while in China, a former US Air Force officer who famously founded the Flying Tigers, a US-funded mercenary air force that supported Chiang Kai-shek's forces during the Chinese Civil War. As regular viewers of this channel likely know now, in 1946, the Flying Tigers would eventually be reformed into Civil Air Transport, the CIA's proprietary airline in Southeast Asia, which would eventually become infamous for its alleged involvement in the booming opium trade in the Lao-Thai-Burmese Golden Triangle. Well, again according to the New York Times, Al Cox apparently served as a quote-unquote special assistant to Chennault in 1949, while he was president to the CAT airline after its creation. And by 1952, Cox served as the president of the CIA charter until 1955. I had mentioned Al Cox in that CIA history video on the Golden Triangle, as he wrote an official agency history piece on the airline, which I quoted from in the past. In that history piece, it states that Cox, quote, guided both the covert operations side and the public commercial side of the airline for a number of years, end quote. Now, with this context, we can start to see why Cox was serving as CIA station chief in Miami, Florida. His previous experience training guerrilla fighters and running a significant airline for the agency would clearly be seen as significant assets in the booming JMWAVE setting. His previous experience also raises questions regarding the alleged firing story shared by Shackley in his memoir. Was he really fired because of this bizarre sick day? I would venture to guess that Cox might have been shuffled back to Southeast Asia, his specialty area, to manage CIA logistics in the growing CIA secret war there. The CAT airline that he once managed had been reformed into Air America in 1960, 2 years earlier, with an even broader mandate. Air transportation logisticians and paramilitary experts were in high demand at the time, roles that he was uniquely proficient in. So for our intents and purposes, we can look at Shackley's innocuous and somewhat bizarre Al Cox firing story as somewhat dubious. Importantly, Cox represented one of the many South Florida CIA staff members that had started their careers in Southeast Asia and had found their way on the sunny coast. And as we will continue to see throughout this documentary, there was a significant link between the agency's operations in Indochina and their operations in South Florida and Louisiana. Although the Blonde Ghost was in charge in Miami, the same questions persisted, a significant one being funding sources. Official CIA budgets did cover salaries and some operational expenses, but generally more controversial spending, such as on weapons and supplies for quote-unquote off-the-books assets, had to be done through unofficial channels to preserve the ever-coveted plausible deniability that the agency ran on. Importantly, when Shackley just arrived at the base, times were flush. The White House initiated, General Lansdale designed Operation Mongoose did guarantee that a steady flow of funds made their way down to the Miami CIA boys for the first months of Shackley's tenure. But with the upcoming Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962, and the Kennedy White House's significant push for détente into 63, White House funds earmarked for covert action against Cuba would dwindle in the latter months of the Blonde Ghost's tenure. This was especially the case for the ongoing assassination programs, which clearly fell outside of the legal purview of international relations. Luckily for the incoming station chief, the CIA had already been hard at work building a robust clandestine financial network over the past decade, a network that would continue to grow and morph throughout the Blonde Ghost's 2 decades-long career at the agency. One of Shackley's enduring legacies would be his central role in the expansion of the CIA's shadow banking and money laundering networks, eventually overseeing the privatization of covert networks as a quote-unquote off-the-books consultant during the Iran-Contra years. We can trace Shackley's financial wizardry back to his time in Miami, as we can convincingly speculate that in Miami in the early 60s, he would have been in close contact with the pioneer of CIA covert payments, the godfather of agency secret banking and narco funding, the one and only Paul Helliwell. Other than the quick mention earlier in relation to Al Cox, it's been a while since I last spoke about Helliwell, former OSS chief in China at the end of World War II, the originator of the CIA narco complex in Southeast Asia, and the founder of Sea Supply Corp, the CIA cutout firm that had been arming the Thai Border Patrol and the breakaway Chinese nationalist forces in the Shan state of Burma, a significant producer of opium throughout much of the Cold War. If you're new here, I have talked extensively about Helliwell in many previous videos. If you want all that background, on screen now are 3 videos where I do discuss his early career in detail. What's important to know about spy, lawyer, banker Paul Helliwell is that by many accounts, he was the first OSS CIA old boy to create the link between narco funding and paramilitary forces during his time in Asia during World War II, and his subsequent work for the CIA stateside as an off-the-books banker. Since his days leading secret intelligence in Southeast Asia for the OSS, Helliwell had returned to his hometown of Miami, Florida. There, he became a partner at his new law firm, Helliwell, Melrose, and DeWolf, and continued to act on the side as one of the CIA and the mob's most trusted bankers. Here's a fact for you all to chew on that opens another can of worms related to Helliwell. After the whole Cuba show had begun to wind down in the mid-60s, Helliwell's law firm were brought on to help broker what would become one of the most significant land deals in Florida history. Helliwell, Melrose, and DeWolf were hired by Walt and Roy Disney from 1964 to 66 to help facilitate the land deal for the future site of Disney World in the Florida Everglades near Orlando. Helliwell was still very much involved with offshore banking and questionable accounting at this time. So this connection with a squeaky clean venture such as Walt Disney World is surprising. It is not too far of a stretch to imagine what kind of information the CIA and other intel agencies could derive from the future theme park, specifically in the areas of social engineering and mass surveillance. But that's all pure speculation. I may dive into some thoughts I have about Disney, social engineering, and their ties to intelligence agencies some other time in a bonus video. But for now, I just wanted to mention this strange intersection between Helliwell and Disney, as I didn't really know where else I'd get the chance to say it, and I do find it very interesting and bizarre. Anyways, moving back to the early 60s, most famously, Helliwell reportedly, according to the Washington Post, acted as one of the primary paymasters for the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, continuing to tap into the financial networks he had been cultivating since the late 40s. Coinciding with Shackley's arrival in Miami in 1962, Helliwell would come to open a bank of his own in the early 60s, with mob-associated Chicago tax attorney Burton Cantor, the now infamous Castle Bank and Trust, based in the Bahamas. Now, although I have yet to find any smoking gun proof of a link between Helliwell and Shackley, and trust me, this has been my sort of white whale since starting this project some 2 years ago, many authors have speculated about the likely relationship between the incoming CIA middle manager and the grizzled back-channel financier. Joseph Trento, in his book Prelude to Terror, notes the following about the relationship. Quote, One of the people who had a profound effect on Shackley was Helliwell, who had arrived in Miami 2 years earlier. Helliwell regaled Shackley and his subordinates with tales of his exploits in Asia. Helliwell showed Shackley in his role as CIA paymaster for JMWAVE the importance of income from agency business fronts. According to numerous case officers who worked at JMWAVE, Helliwell helped Shackley make certain that fronts like Zenith Technical Enterprises were the perfect cover for JMWAVE. End quote. Although Trento is working off of unverifiable testimonies, the probable links between Shackley and Helliwell are compelling based on circumstantial evidence. For one, Shackley would, as I had previously mentioned, go from the Miami station chief job directly to the top job in Laos in 1966 at the height of the Secret War. Given Helliwell's instrumental role in setting up the CIA narco complex at the end of World War II, a complex that would be critical in the Laos conflict, it would make sense that Shackley would be briefed or coached by Helliwell in the preceding years, when they were both together in Miami. Additionally, jumping ahead almost a decade now, Helliwell's Castle Bank and Trust would come to be superseded by the CIA's next narco bank, the infamous Nugan Hand Bank of Sydney, Australia, a suspected major vector and money launderer of illicit narco funds from the wars in Southeast Asia. Shackley himself and his close associates at CIA, dating all the way back to the JMWAVE days, would play prominent roles in the founding and operations of the Nugan Hand Bank, as we will come to see much later. Shackley was, throughout his career, a silent administrator of the shell companies and firms used in the laundering network of the CIA. Well, as you can see on screen now, is a picture shared by Jonathan Quitney in his book about Nugan Hand called The Crimes of Patriots. Here we see an elderly Paul Helliwell shaking hands with Frank Nugan, one of the co-founders and namesakes of the Shackley-affiliated Nugan Hand Bank. This picture appears to indicate a passing of the torch in the early 70s from the soon-to-be shut-down Castle Bank, founded by Helliwell, to the newly established Nugan Hand Bank, coordinated by Shackley. And from here we see the evolution of CIA shadow banking, from Helliwell to Shackley. And given Helliwell's work as a consistent paymaster for JMWAVE in Miami, we can convincingly conclude that the two probably first met in Miami in either 62 or 63, and that Helliwell had a significant impact on the Blonde Ghost, maybe even as a potential mentor. This relationship also exemplifies an ongoing trend that I will continue to point out throughout this season of the show, that being the links between Southeast Asia and South Florida, or the Caribbean as a whole. During this same period, Helliwell boasted the Thai consulate in Miami out of his law offices. His direct ties to the opium fields of Burma and Thailand would indicate that laundered narco profits could have been used to fund anti-Castro operations, exemplifying the truly global implications of this narcotics web. Shackley represented the same trajectory, only in reverse, moving from South Florida directly to Laos, then Vietnam. It appeared, and as I will continue to show, that the CIA's operations in Southeast Asia and the Gulf Coast were somehow intrinsically connected. Beyond Helliwell and his Castle Bank and Trust, Shackley could also count on funding from several rich benefactors who sponsored adjacent anti-Castro operations. One such figure was a man who I have discussed at length before, and will continue to as we dive deeper into these networks. That being businessman, former ambassador, and right-wing activist William Pawley. Pawley himself had grown up in Cuba and owned several Cuban firms before the revolution, such as Havana's Bus Services and the Talisman Sugar Company. Pawley, much like Helliwell, represented the same East-West interlinks, having been a prominent sponsor of Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers in the early 40s as an executive at Curtiss-Wright, and having personally worked with Admiral Charles Cook to deliver planes to Chiang Kai-shek on Taiwan shortly after the end of the Chinese Civil War. Pawley was, as I've mentioned before, a prominent member of the China lobby, but also with prominent links in Latin America, as in the 1940s and 50s, Pawley served as an ambassador to Brazil and Peru. And as a close personal friend to Dwight Eisenhower, he was a dependable ally to Ike and his foreign policy staff, especially in covert actions. Pawley was a central player in the 1954 CIA Guatemalan coup under PB Success, and was instrumental in the very early anti-Castro operations. According to an official CIA history paper about the Bay of Pigs, In December of 1958, before Batista was ousted by Castro, Pawley went to Havana to meet with his acquaintance and convince him to step down peacefully. According to the paper, quote, Pawley was a longtime acquaintance and friend of Batista from the days when Pawley had been running the Cubana airline, end quote. Accordingly, after the December 11th meeting in Havana between Pawley and Batista, the besieged Cuban dictator refused to step down. And well, we know the rest. A few weeks later, on New Year's Day, 1959, Batista was out of there. But this was not the end of Pawley's involvement with the Cuba show. Actually, it was only the beginning. When in March of 1960, the Nixon-Dulles team got together to start planning the early stages of the Bay of Pigs invasion, Pawley, a close personal friend of Allen Dulles, and a major donor to President Eisenhower and Vice President Richard Nixon, was pulled directly into the CIA's planning staff. On April 1st, 1960, so really at the beginning of the anti-Castro planning, Pawley hosted CIA Director Dulles, CIA Western Hemisphere Chief J.C. King, General Cushman, and several business leaders, including a VP from United Steel, at his house in Miami to discuss how to best use Cuban exile assets in the escalating secret war. During the so-called Phase 1 anti-Castro operations under Ike, Nixon, and Dulles, Pawley was a central player. But with the old general out, and JFK calling the shots starting in 1961, the private benefactor Pawley was no longer directly involved in the planning. But to a guy like Shackley, Pawley was still floating around the Miami area, ready to sponsor some of his most daring and unconventional anti-Castro plots. Most notably, Pawley would provide several gunboats to CIA-sponsored Cuban exile groups, attempting to create the so-called Flying Tigers of the Caribbean. As official funding channels dried up after JFK pulled back on anti-Castro operations post-missile crisis, private sponsors such as William Pawley and increasingly Texas oil tycoon H.L. Hunt would come to fill the gap not only for the CIA, but also for disgruntled exiles who shared the hardliner millionaires' disdain for the Kennedy brothers. We will see the impact of this private funding and the intersections within said operations later down the line. Rounding out Shackley's JMWAVE back-channel financial network was a man we looked at intensely in recent videos I made, none other than young businessman George H.W. Bush of Zapata Offshore. As I covered in Part 3 of the Bush series, CIA-affiliated business asset Poppy Bush had established offices for his Houston-based offshore oil drilling company Zapata in Marathon, Florida, right in the middle of the Florida Keys. This put Zapata resources such as offshore rigs, boats, and helicopters right in JMWAVE's backyard. The use of offshore rigs as forward operating bases, either as listening posts or training structures for commandos, made Bush's oil business a perfect analog to Shackley's work out of Miami. Beyond pure speculation and circumstantial evidence, such as the fact that Shackley would be elevated to his highest role at CIA under Bush's directorship of the agency in the mid-70s, a decade and a half later, I have found some hints from Shackley himself even that would indicate that the relationship between both men started while Shackley was running JMWAVE Station from 1962 to 65. Returning to his book Spy Master, Shackley states the following, quote, "Our paramilitary teams and boat operators were in and out of Cuban waters all the time, and had the opportunity to meet with Cuban fishing trawlers at places like the island of Cay Sal." End quote. Now, I mentioned in my previous documentary about Shackley's early career that to a seasoned reader, Shackley does tell on himself at times in his largely sanitized memoir. Well, here, Shackley's mention of CIA assets meeting at Cay Sal Island is hugely significant to establishing an early relationship between Bush and Ted. Because I will remind you, in the early 60s, Cay Sal was being leased by none other than Zapata Offshore, by George H.W. Bush's company. There could have conceivably even been a Zapata mobile rig there at the time. In turn, with this small admission, we get further evidence that Shackley knew Bush in these days, and that Bush was moonlighting for the CIA. But if you ask me though, evidence such as this is hardly needed in this case. Shackley was the CIA master of South Florida, and as I hopefully established enough in my previous videos about Bush, he was very likely a CIA business asset at the time. It would have been almost more unlikely that they did not come into contact with each other during this period in the interconnected networks on the Gulf Coast. Besides honing his skills in back-channel funding and shadow banking, by all accounts Shackley brought his bureaucratic mastery and organizational wizardry to JMWAVE. He was uncompromising, and almost immediately took the steps necessary to transform the chaotic and disorganized spy station into his own ruthlessly efficient spook shop. According to David Korn in his biography of Ted Shackley, the Blonde Ghost was especially controlling of the paramilitary staff at his base, the ones training the Cuban exiles. Korn notes, quote, "He ordered the station's cowboys to submit detailed operational plans. Case officers dreaded the time when they had to brief Shackley on a proposed action." End quote. Korn also shares a testimony from one of these paramilitary experts, one Grayston Lynch, a Special Forces vet who had actually just come back from working on the CIA's Operation White Star in Laos in 1960, which I will remind you was one of the early paramilitary operations there in Southeast Asia, and also continues to illustrate this link between East Asia and the Gulf Coast. After his time in Laos, and despite explicit orders to not include any Americans on the ground, Lynch was also one of the few Americans to land at the Bay of Pigs with Brigade 2506, and was reportedly one of the first men off the boat. He was ultimately able to evade capture and return to JMWAVE, training exiles under Shackley. Lynch described to David Korn Shackley's seemingly infinite capacity at absorbing information. Korn writes, quote, "When Lynch handed him, here Shackley, a proposal for a raid, Shackley read it so fast it seemed he was at best skimming. But then, days or weeks later, Shackley quoted whole passages. Lynch drew a useful conclusion. You didn't try to bullshit him." End quote. Essentially what Lynch was suggesting was that Shackley had something akin to a photographic memory. Not surprising given the countless reports of Ted's inordinate ability to retain information and at tracking assets. The team that Shackley assembled around him at JMWAVE would come to follow the reclusive spy master across the rest of his CIA career. Much like George H.W. Bush, Shackley was known to elevate those he trusted alongside him, as he was himself elevated through the ranks at the agency. Trust was critical to the Blonde Ghost, especially as he was involved in increasingly illegal networks related to narcotics and shadowy financial networks. When Shackley first arrived in Miami in February of '62, he soon met one of his new young case officers, a man by the name of Thomas Clines. Clines had been working for the CIA since the late 40s, at the inception of the agency, but had just been brought into the Caribbean operations in 1960 to train Cuban exiles at a facility in Panama. The waspy and gregarious Clines represented the perfect foil to the unpolished and cold Shackley. Whereas Shackley strived amongst paperwork and executive reports, Clines was a people person, working as a key recruiter of Cuban assets. At first, according to David Korn, Clines was unsure about Shackley and reportedly even considered quitting when the new chief was announced. Disillusioned by the failure at the Bay of Pigs and the loss of several of his assets in the process, Clines was unconvinced that much would change under new management. The case officer had formed uniquely close ties with many of the Cuban exiles, most prominently Rafael Chichi Quintero of Operation 40, the elite squad of Cuban operators pulled aside from the Brigade 2506 rabble. Clines and Quintero would reunite in the 70s and 80s as key arms traffickers within the Iran-Contra networks, under the guidance of the one and only Ted Shackley. But as for the early 60s in Miami, Clines would quickly put aside his reservations about his new boss and would subsequently become as close to a sidekick to Shackley as anyone would become. He would follow the Blonde Ghost to Laos and Vietnam, and worked to establish front companies for his longtime boss after the CIA was reorganized under the Carter presidency. Tom Clines in many ways acted as Shackley's eyes and ears on the ground, as the reclusive spy master was rarely spotted in public. Having good rapport with the exiles, Clines could work to deliver the arch spook's orders and to report back with the latest developments in Little Havana. Not all of Shackley's first impressions went as well as with Tom Clines. Upon his arrival in Miami and assumption of the station chief role shortly after, a new chief of covert operations, I'll remind you the job that Shackley was supposed to fill, ascended to the role. That was a man named Rocky Farnsworth. Their relationship was immediately, and excuse the pun, off to a rocky start due to Shackley's controlling tendencies. According to David Korn again, Farnsworth, quote, resented the intrusions of Shackley, who had no experience in this field. After a short time of wrangling with Shackley over specifics of various missions, Farnsworth dropped an ultimatum. If you don't quit interfering, I'm out of here. Shackley responded, "You're out now." End quote. Cold as ice as usual, Shackley immediately replaced the outgoing Farnsworth with a man that I spoke about before in relation to Operation 40, as covert operations chief at JMWAVE. The one and only El Indio, David Morales. There is actually a possibility that Shackley had first met the ruthless Dave Morales in Germany, as the former army corporal had served there before he was scouted for CIA work. Maybe Shackley had even played some role in that recruitment. In his book Spy Master, Shackley actually notes that Morales was Clines' direct boss before he arrived. This would explain how Clines got involved with Chichi Quintero and the rest of the Op 40 squad. And as it would have it, the killer Morales, who was reportedly the trainer of the shooting team within Operation 40, would also follow Shackley to Laos and eventually end up in Vietnam, where he'd be a major operator within the Phoenix program. I was able to dig up this photo that you see on screen now from an amazing blog called Tango Down 63, which I highly recommend you go check out. I linked it below. They've shared a ton of photos that I've never seen anywhere else of some major players in the JFK assassination. Anyways, this photo apparently depicts Dave Morales and Thomas Clines years later at what looks to be a CIA reunion event. The caption of the photo notes that this was allegedly scheduled on the anniversary of Che Guevara's death. Grim photo if this is true, but it does also exemplify that Morales and his former apprentice Clines did seem to keep in touch throughout the years. As I mentioned in my previous video, Morales was a killer by all accounts, an assassination expert who was ruthless and cold as ice. He has also figured prominently in several JFK assassination theories, and rightfully so. If you had to point to one man at CIA that was capable of killing JFK or training a killer to do so, nobody would fault you for choosing El Indio. Tom Clines, Shackley's sidekick, recalled that Morales was devoutly loyal to Shackley. It is not difficult to imagine how Morales would come to be used in Shackley's upcoming paramilitary escapades, especially in the ongoing training of hit squads. Morales' ties with the CIA in the Caribbean traced all the way back to the Guatemalan coup in 1954, Operation PB Success, which was a bit of a foundational moment for this Caribbean squad of CIA agents. He was part of the original team there that included E. Howard Hunt and David Atlee Phillips, that would remain in place during the Cuban Revolution as well. Morales was actually working out of the Havana CIA station during the last 2 years of the revolution, so 1958 to 1960. Working alongside him at the Havana station was his ongoing colleague, David Atlee Phillips, a man that would also figure prominently in most theories concerning the CIA and the JFK assassination. Now, I want to save our discussion about David Atlee Phillips for next time, when we turn the clock back to revolutionary Cuba. My point here with Morales is that his ties with exiles went back to pre-Castro Cuba, and his closeness to agents such as David Atlee Phillips and E. Howard Hunt made him an invaluable asset to the incoming station chief, Ted Shackley, who could tap these CIA veterans in upcoming schemes. Maybe the most complicated dynamic for Shackley in Miami was the constant question of authority. Although Ted was the top man on the ground at JMWAVE, he reported upwards to a confusing structure of bosses. Directly above him at CIA HQ in Langley was his former boss at the Berlin station over the previous 6 or so years, the aforementioned William Harvey, who had been put in charge of the CIA's Task Force W, otherwise known as the Cuban Division. Interestingly, in his book Spy Master, Shackley claims that the W in Task Force W stood for William Walker, the 19th century American so-called filibusterer who successfully invaded Nicaragua and installed himself as its president for a little under a year from 1856 to 57. Walker himself would eventually be executed by firing squad following a joint intervention by neighboring Latin American republics to oust the Yankee imperialists. Shackley even notes in his book that this naming was somewhat ironic, as by early 1963, Harvey would himself be executed from the Miami beat, shuffled out in favor of CIA old boy Desmond Fitzgerald. But even before the name became ironic, Harvey's authority on Task Force W was continuously challenged by the Special Group Augmented, the White House Cuba Task Force led concurrently by Bobby Kennedy and General Edward Lansdale. In a sense, the Kennedy White House's Cuba show was a two-headed beast, split between the CIA's Harvey and the White House Special Group. To the loudmouthed Harvey, this constant interloping and oversight by the hard-nosed Bobby Kennedy was intensely frustrating. RFK, or as David Korn describes him, the quote, over-eager godfather of Operation Mongoose, wanted to be apprised of everything, often dropping by unannounced at JMWAVE in Miami and poking his head into station business. According to Hinkle and Turner, quote, Harvey rebelled at the restrictions. He complained to Director McCone about the requirements for advance SGA approval of quote-unquote major operations going beyond the collection of intelligence, and the fact that applications had to be spelled out in excruciating detail, end quote. Even to such things as the, quote, gradient on the beach and the composition of the sand on the beach in many cases, end quote. This was the beginning of a now well-documented feud between RFK and Bill Harvey, one of several well-known feuds that the younger Kennedy cultivated. Also of note are Bobby Kennedy's feuds with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover and Vice President Lyndon Johnson. All three of these men would figure in some ways into the theories surrounding the assassination of Bobby's brother. According to the testimony of fellow JMWAVE operatives, the opportunistic Ted Shackley also turned on his old boss Harvey, the man who elevated him from the Berlin base, when the wind started to shift. Joseph Trento relays statements made to him by CIA agent John Sherwood, a case officer at JMWAVE during this period. Sherwood told the author that Shackley, quote, worked hard at cultivating Robert Kennedy at the expense of Harvey, end quote. Trento goes so far as saying, quote, it was Shackley's relationship with Bobby Kennedy that would destroy Harvey's career during the Cuban Missile Crisis and make Shackley the most important young executive in CIA, end quote. This cozying up to the often visiting RFK appeared to be more opportunistic than genuine on Shackley's part. We will explore this animosity between Shackley and Kennedy a bit later, but it was clear at the time to the young spy master that RFK, for now anyways, was the one truly calling the shots over Harvey and even Deputy Director of Plans Richard Helms. Grayston Lynch, the paramilitary expert, said the following about Bobby Kennedy's frequent visits. Quote, I'd come to the safe house in the morning, and they would say Bobby says this, Bobby says that, end quote. In that same vein, according to David Korn, RFK often circumvented the case officers and paramilitary experts at JMWAVE and met with Cuban exile group leaders privately, even inviting some of the more prominent ones to his family's estate. Operation Mongoose puttered along throughout the mid-year months of 1962 as JMWAVE continued to fund a dizzying array of Cuban exile groups while continuing attempts to infiltrate exiles and assets into Cuba. Shackley's Miami station also proceeded with the hit-and-run sabotage missions that were meant to fulfill the quote-unquote 1,000 small pinprick strategy and, as Lansdale envisioned it, to spur an eventual revolution. The infiltrations continued to fall short of the general's ambitious timetable, and not much had changed for Shackley from the days of trying to infiltrate Polish assets behind the Iron Curtain from the Berlin CIA base. As for the hit-and-run sabotage operations, they were mostly counterproductive. Shackley and Harvey's personal involvement in such plots is recorded in the official history, shared by the Church Committee. This involvement included assisting in the ongoing mafia assassination plots that Harvey had revived in late 1961 under ZRRIFLE. According to the Church Committee timeline, in late April of 1962, quote, Harvey, with the help of Ted Shackley, chief of JMWAVE station in Miami, loaded arms and equipment in a U-Haul truck, which was left in a parking lot for Roselli, who delivered it to a Cuban contact, end quote. As I made clear in my previous documentary about the CIA mafia plots, these largely went nowhere. As for the sabotage operations, they were more of a mixed bag. One of the most notable plans was the plot to destroy the Matahambre copper mine in Pinar del Rio, one of the major pieces of the unstable Cuban economy. One of the Cubans tasked by JMWAVE to go on the mission, one Roberto San Roman, claimed, quote, they gave us good training, with scale models of the shafts and the way they took the minerals up from the mines. And we had big targets and special demolition equipment and all that. We were trained for 2 weeks using rubber rafts, big ships, and small ships, end quote. Despite the rigorous training, the whole operation fell apart on the fateful day. According to Special Forces vet and paramilitary trainer Grayston Lynch, the boat the saboteurs were provided was old and in bad shape. It died midway at sea, and the hired exiles had to call for a rescue craft. JMWAVE made a few more attempts on the mine, with little success. These failures were the norm, not the exception, when it came to the sabotage operations in Operation Mongoose. And those that did succeed did little to fuel a popular reaction against Castro, mostly serving the opposite purpose of emboldening him and his supporters. At least that's what we're told in the official record. The Matahambre mine story is one that is shared widely in almost every book about the secret war against Castro. What is often glazed over, however, and what I will get into in the next episode, is the effective cultivation of a powerful paramilitary underground on the Gulf Coast, a sort of ecosystem that would remain in place long after the CIA set its sights away from the island of Cuba. The Mongoose pinprick strategy may have failed in its stated purpose of deposing Castro, but it did succeed in creating a secret army for the CIA in the Western Hemisphere, and in turn, bolstering the agency's paramilitary capabilities just in time for its future work in Southeast Asia. Ultimately, gun-toting Bill Harvey would be blamed by the White House for the failure of Operation Mongoose and would be shuffled out of the Cuba show in disgrace by the end of 1962. Bobby Kennedy bluntly stated regarding Harvey, quote, "We'd been working with him for a year, and no accomplishments," end quote. In contrast to the other spooks on the Cuba file who got major career boosts from their work in Miami, the Mongoose period represented the beginning of a gradual decline for old Bill Harvey, as he took the brunt of the blame for the failures of the Cuba project. The animosity that had grown between Harvey and the Kennedys reached a fever pitch after his dismissal from the Cuba file. Ultimately, he was sent on his final significant assignment as CIA station chief in Rome, Italy, in early 1963, a dream appointment for many such spooks. Many have speculated that instead of taking his new role seriously, Harvey went rogue and was in some ways involved in the plot to kill JFK, a plot that was brewing throughout 1963. Rome, often overlooked by Kennedy researchers, represented a major node in the international elements of the JFK hit, as we will explore thoroughly later this year. David Talbot, in his book The Devil's Chessboard, relays an interview he conducted with Dan Hardaway, a Cornell law student who was a member of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Talbot notes that Hardaway was part of the group on the committee that was tasked with finding links between the agency and the death of the president. Hardaway claimed the following, quote, "We did come across documents that suggested Harvey was traveling a lot in the weeks leading up to the assassination, while he was supposed to be running the Rome station. Near the end of our investigation, I typed up a memo making my case against Harvey as a leading figure in the crime. I typed it up in the committee's secure room, on the yellow security paper with a purple border marked top secret. That memo has since disappeared." End quote. It is unsurprising that many assassination researchers have latched onto Harvey as a prime suspect in the planning of the crime of the century, given his role as an assassination czar at CIA and his personal beef with both JFK and RFK by 1963. Not to mention, he was a close confidant of several other prime suspects, such as cold-blooded killer David Morales and arch-schemer E. Howard Hunt. It also should be noted that despite Harvey being taken off the Cuba show by the end of 1962, according to official timelines declassified during the Church Commission in 1975, Harvey was apparently still in contact with figures such as Johnny Roselli until June of 1963, when he was ostensibly supposed to be heading the Rome station. Although the record indicates that this was their last meeting, it does seem to imply that Harvey was still plugged into Operation ZRRIFLE at the time, the CIA's executive action or assassination program, even though he was let go from Task Force W, the Cuba show. Something else to think about there, as ZRRIFLE did have a significant international scope, especially in schemes in Africa, which I do hope to cover sometime later. Personally, I don't want to get too hung up on the Harvey angle of the assassination quite yet. There are still plenty of prime suspects that I have yet to cover. And Harvey, for his part, would succumb to his alcoholism in the years following Kennedy's death while in Italy. Agency career-wise, his posting in Rome would be a dead end for him, despite the ramp-up of Operation Gladio, which he had reportedly worked to cultivate during his time there. In the end, Harvey's alcoholism would be his ultimate downfall. By 1968, he retired from CIA, sobered up, and went off the grid, moving back to his home state of Indiana. Harvey would die from a heart attack in Indianapolis in 1976 at age 60, a little under a year after he testified at the Church Committee. Amongst his long list of accolades was the elevation of Ted Shackley from lowly case officer in Berlin to top spy in Miami. The repercussions of such a move likely far exceeded any of his expectations at the time. In his own memoir, Shackley treads out the tried and true agency position on the anti-Cuba operations that he oversaw, that the failed policies were not the CIA's choice, but more attributable to the whims of the embattled Kennedys. As he puts it, quote, "The CIA had toppled foreign regimes before, in Iran in 1953, in Guatemala in 1954, and it had tried again and failed disastrously in 1961. He continues, quote, "Whereas in the three previous cases our intervention had been motivated by considerations of Cold War advantage, the driving for now was personal vendetta. President Kennedy and his brother Robert, smarting from the humiliation of their failure at the Bay of Pigs, wanted to remove Fidel Castro from the picture, no matter whether by palace revolt, military coup, popular uprising, or assassination." End quote. Shackley's resentment of the Kennedys does add up, given RFK's constant interloping and their hands-on approach to the Cuba show, often at the expense of full CIA autonomy. Most notably in this saga was the aforementioned beef between Robert Kennedy and Task Force W Chief Bill Harvey. It had reportedly been RFK specifically that called for Harvey's transfer in late 1962, in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Shackley may have held some contempt for this move, but as it seemed to always happen to the Kennedys, their attempt to remove problematic elements from the CIA simply brought in new and arguably more competent bad elements in return. Bill Harvey, as chief of the Cuba show, was replaced with former white shoe lawyer turned CIA agent Desmond Fitzgerald. Having once fought alongside the Chinese nationalists during World War II, Des Fitz, as he was known, had been hired at CIA in 1950 and was sent to work in East Asia under Frank Wisner's Office of Policy Coordination and the subsequent Directorate of Plans. Harvard-educated and a mainstay of Richard Bissell's waspy Georgetown set, Fitzgerald would eventually be elevated to head of the Eastern Hemisphere Division, one rung under the Directorate of Plans. I actually mentioned Des Fitz a long time ago in Part 4 of the Secret War in Laos series, as the first CIA official to authorize the training of Hmong guerrillas in Laos, in a sense beginning the CIA's secret war there. And as it would have it, in late 1962, Desmond Fitzgerald would be shipped back stateside to take over the Cuba show from the disgraced Bill Harvey. There, according to David Korn, he would come to be a mentor for the JMWAVE station chief Ted Shackley, who I will remind you would take over Des's Hmong army in Laos some years later. Fitzgerald once again represented the links between East Asia and the Caribbean, as yet another CIA big shot that made the trip from one theater to another. Fitzgerald would lead the Cuba show all the way until Kennedy's death in November of '63. And in 1964, he'd be rewarded with a promotion to head the Western Hemisphere Division entirely. That is, until 1965, right before Shackley settled into his new role in Laos in '66. Des would be made Deputy Director of Plans, once Richard Helms was promoted to the Deputy Directorship of the whole agency in that same year, leaving the position vacant. Holding the top covert action job until 1967, Fitzgerald would oversee the secret war in Laos from Langley, as his acolyte Shackley ran the game on the ground from Longcheng. So in a sense, Harvey's dismissal from the Cuba show led to the mentor-mentee relationship between Fitzgerald and Shackley, which solidified the young spook's fate as the head of the secret war in Laos in the mid-60s, and later heading the Phoenix program from Saigon. Once again, the Kennedys tried to shuffle the agency and only ended up further entrenching the problematic old boys in the process. As for Operation Mongoose, the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 largely signaled its end, and the end of most White House-sanctioned anti-Castro activities. With the world on the brink of nuclear Armageddon, something changed in the young president. From October 1962 until his untimely death in November of the next year, President Kennedy made significant strides towards détente with both the Soviet Union and Cuba. Kennedy successfully navigated the potentially apocalyptic situation in the Caribbean using diplomacy, and was able to extract the nuclear warheads from Cuba in exchange for the withdrawal of US Jupiter missiles in Turkey, missiles that were going to be replaced anyways. This was one of the first significant wins of Kennedy's presidency, after consistent humiliation in regards to Cuba. And as one final act before the end of the year, on December 29, 1962, as seen in the footage on screen now. President Kennedy, alongside Manuel Artime, welcomed back the 1,113 imprisoned Brigade 2506 invaders returned from Cuba at Miami's Orange Bowl for a grand celebration. The Kennedy administration paid the Castro government some $53 million in medical equipment and other supplies to guarantee the return of the doomed invaders. Kennedy, despite his personal commitment to détente, told the freed Cubans and the thousands of people in the audience while unfurling the yellow Brigade 2506 flag that,
"And I can assure you that it is the strongest wish of the people of this country, as well as the people of this hemisphere, that Cuba shall one day be free again. And when it is, this brigade will deserve to march at the head of the free column."
Lofty promises. Promises that would quickly sour, as the Kennedy administration intensified its crackdown of exile activities against Cuba on the Gulf Coast. On January 4, 1963, only a little over a week after Kennedy gave his harrowing speech at the Orange Bowl, National Security Advisor Mac Bundy claimed, quote, "There is well nigh universal agreement that Mongoose is at a dead end," end quote. For 1963, the White House shifted from promoting anti-Castro activity to trying to shut it all down, which would prove to be the final straw for the most radical exiles. Many viewed the Kennedys almost in the same light as Castro, and were forced to turn to other sources of support for their ongoing machinations. The CIA, as always, was ready to lend a helping hand, with or without White House sanction. Rogue military intelligence elements also came to fill the void left by the Kennedy White House's exit from the anti-Cuba show, quietly supporting exiles against the president that increasingly refused to get involved in their chosen battleground, that being Vietnam. And finally, the private business interests, the Texas Cowboys and the old China lobby crowd, opened their wallets to help the newly orphaned paramilitary groups. 1963 was the boiling over point for the coalition of forces opposing the Kennedys. With the exiles turning on the White House, the hidden forces had their foot soldiers in the plot against JFK. Things are about to get much messier, as the assassination program against Castro begins to turn against the young president. And as we approach that fateful day, next time, I want to zoom in even closer, looking for the first time at the paramilitary groups themselves, from the ground level. Following the journey of 3 American paramilitary men from the Cuban Revolution all the way to the unauthorized camps in Florida and New Orleans on the eve of the death of the president. So with all that said, we're turning the clock back to where it all began. The Cuban Revolution, 1958. Thank you all for watching, as always, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please leave a like and a comment and let me know your thoughts down below. It helps a lot with the algorithm. First and foremost, I would like to thank all of my supporters over on Patreon for making these videos possible. On screen now are my producer tier patrons. The video you just watched was first made available to them on March 12th, 2025. If you wish to get early access to my content, and view small Patreon bonus videos, and finally connect with me on a more personal level, please consider checking out my page on Patreon, linked below in the description. Last week, I just uploaded the second chapter of my new spin-off series overviewing the making of modern Japan. As it stands, this series is already nearing 4 hours in length, with the third and final installment coming by the end of November, and this will be anywhere from 2 to 2.5 hours as well. This Japan project has been a real passion project for me this year, as I hope to provide an overview of Japan's development up to World War II, and a look at geopolitics in East Asia more broadly over the 19th and 20th centuries. As you all know, this is always an area of interest of mine. So the new Japan series and much more available on Patreon, linked below as always. Now on YouTube, you can expect more frequent uploads until the end of the year 2025. For the next 5 Fridays, you will be treated to the first 5 episodes of my Road to Dallas series, which has been a huge hit on Patreon so far. These first 5 episodes will comprise of a deep dive into the paramilitary networks in revolutionary Cuba, the networks that would later hop over to Florida and form the contours of the anti-Castro underground and the JFK assassination nexus. This will be an ongoing long-form series that I hope to pick back up in 2026 where we left off. The first part of this series, premiering next Friday, will begin with a look at a maybe familiar figure up to this point, the one and only Frank Fiorini, known better by his alias, Frank Sturgis. But for now, this is all I've got for you today. So thank you all for watching, and remember to always keep your eyes wide open. Take care.